Pirates. The very word conjures up images of a black flag with a skull and crossbones, or treasure chests of Spanish doubloons, maybe a cutlass-wielding sailor with an eye patch and a wooden leg, perhaps with a parrot on his shoulder. It's a stereotype, of course, though there were such pirates. The most famous of them was Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, who operated out of the North Carolina Sounds during the early 18th century in what was called the Golden Age of piracy, well before there was a United States, much less a United States Navy. When Congress created the U.S. Navy in 1798, combating piracy was practically its first task, and it remains one of its missions even today, though the nature of piracy has changed dramatically since the days of Edward Teach. Piracy became a particular concern for the U.S. Navy in the years after the War of 1812. That war had had a profound impact on the American psyche. Most Americans believed, or at least they felt, that the United States had won the war. They had taken on the greatest naval power on earth and had not only survived, they had humbled the vaunted Royal Navy in several single-ship frigate duels and won important battles on both Lake Erie and Lake Champlain. Combined with a successful defense of New Orleans during the waning days of the war, the sense of victory, if not quite the reality of it, gave rise to a national euphoria that some historians have labeled the era of good feeling. That spirit of robust nationalism was further enhanced almost immediately by another success in the Mediterranean against what Americans called the Barbary pirates. The Mediterranean shore of Africa was called the Barbary Coast after the Berbers, its original inhabitants. The United States had fought a war with the North African city-state of Tripoli in the early 19th century, rendering it, as well as Algiers, temporarily quiescent. During the War of 1812, however, while the United States was preoccupied with Britain, the ruler of Algiers, who was called a Dey, spelled D-E-Y, sensed an opportunity and declared war on the United States. As long as the War of 1812 continued, there was little the administration of James Madison could do about it. But as soon as news of the Treaty of Ghent reached Washington, Madison asked Congress for authority to respond to the new threat, and within days, the United States began to assemble not one, but two U.S. Navy squadrons to deal with Algiers. The first squadron was commanded by William Bainbridge, who back in 1803, during the First Barbary War, had suffered the embarrassment of running the frigate Philadelphia aground off Tripoli and being forced to surrender it. The sting of that humiliation had been partially eased by his victory over the British frigate Java during the War of 1812, but now he hoped that a victory over Algiers would eradicate the stain altogether. Bainbridge's problem was that the big ship of the line Independence, which he planned to use as his flagship, was not quite ready for sea, and that delayed his departure. The commander of the second American squadron was Stephen Decatur, who felt that he too had something to prove. Decatur had earned international fame for leading the daring raid into Tripoli harbor to destroy the captured Philadelphia, and like Bainbridge, he had won a frigate victory in 1812. But in January of 1815, he had been forced to surrender the frigate President to a superior British squadron. There was no shame in that. He had capitulated to overwhelming force. Still, he felt the need to secure a new triumph to reestablish his reputation. Decatur got to the Mediterranean first, arriving at Gibraltar on June 12, 1815, with a squadron of 3 frigates and 7 smaller vessels. There, he learned that the Algerine war fleet had just left and he set out in pursuit. He caught up with it a few days later and immediately attacked. The American ships pounded the Algerine flagship, Mashuda, until, with her captain dead and 160 casualties on her deck, she struck her flag. Decatur then captured a second Algerine warship, the Estudio, a few days later, leaving Algiers with almost no navy left. Thus, when Decatur arrived off Algiers, the Dey hesitated only briefly before agreeing to a new treaty with no tribute payments. Decatur then took his squadron to both Tunis and Tripoli, where his show of force compelled similar agreements. Consequently, by the time Bainbridge and his squadron arrived, the war was virtually over, though he also visited each of the Barbary states to flaunt America's naval might as a deterrent to future bad behavior. Despite all of that, the Dey of Algiers tore up the treaty he had just signed the moment the Americans left. So the United States prepared a third squadron. This one, as it turned out, was not needed. That's because the United States was not the only country that was fed up with Barbary predations. In August of 1816, an Anglo-Dutch fleet commanded by a British admiral, Sir Edward Pellew, arrived at Algiers. He shelled the ships in the harbor and the city itself so ruthlessly that the Dey agreed to free all his prisoners and forswear the Barbary system forever. Even then, the pillaging of merchant ships by Algerine pirates did not end completely until 1830, when France landed an army there and turned Algiers into the French colony of Algeria. For the United States, and especially its Navy, this second Barbary War added to the national sense of well-being after 1815. It also marked the establishment of a regular U.S. presence in the Mediterranean. For the next 45 years, until the outbreak of the Civil War, the United States Navy would maintain a squadron of warships in the Mediterranean. There was another long-term consequence of U.S. naval success in the War of 1812. For more than a generation, Congress had argued over what kind of navy the United States should have. Navalists wanted a traditional battleship navy like England or France, but they were mostly outvoted by anti-navalists who wanted a defensive navy composed of frigates and sloops, even gunboats. Though the American frigates had performed well in the War of 1812, anti-navalist arguments for a small, defensive navy were undercut by the disastrous performance of the gunboats in both the Chesapeake Bay and at New Orleans. Therefore, in the wake of this second Barbary War, Congress passed two pieces of legislation that at last fulfilled the navalist vision of what a Navy should be. One of them established a board of Navy commissioners. Until then, the day-to-day management of the Navy had been the responsibility of the Secretary of the Navy personally, who was both the administrative head of the service and, for all practical purposes, the strategic commander. This new board of Navy commissioners gave serving officers a voice in both policy and in operations. The other law was more significant. Basking in what President James Madison called the Navy's brilliant success, Congress appropriated more than $1 million a year, quite serious money in 1816, to gradually increase the size of the Navy. The legislation specified that the United States would build 9 new ships of the line, each of at least 74 guns, plus a dozen heavy frigates of 44 guns each. The United States Navy would still be significantly inferior to the Royal Navy, but it would be large enough to compel European powers to take notice. Passage of these two bills in 1816 marked a turning point. Previously, many Americans had conceived of the Navy as an emergency force to be called up in time of crisis, like a maritime militia. Now it became a standing force capable of not just defending the coast, but also of extending American influence to the Mediterranean or any other part of the world where American interests were under threat. One such area was the Caribbean, where piracy was making a comeback largely because of ongoing revolutionary movements in the colonies of Spanish America. Inspired by both the American and French revolutions, the Spanish colonies in Central and South America sought their own independence. Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín led revolutions in Venezuela, Colombia, and elsewhere, and several of these self-proclaimed republics issued letters of marque for privateers to prey on Spanish merchant shipping. The boundary between privateering and outright piracy had always been tenuous. This was especially true when privateers sailed in the name of self-proclaimed governments that may not be universally recognized. During the American Revolution, the British had routinely referred to American privateers as pirates. British newspapers even called John Paul Jones a pirate, though he was not a privateer at all, but an officer in the Continental Navy. A generation later, during the American Civil War, Union newspapers routinely referred to Confederate raiders like the Alabama and the Florida as pirates. And as far as Spain was concerned, all the privateers that sailed from Colombia and Venezuela were also pirates. For some of them, it was an accurate designation. The issuing governments were not especially discriminating in how many letters of marque they issued or whom they issued them to. And once these would-be privateers were at sea, many found that while there were relatively few Spanish merchant ships for them to attack, there were quite a few American ships in the Caribbean. Some of the privateers found the temptation to seize them too great to resist. One such opportunist was the French-American Jean Lafitte, who operated a smuggling ring out of the Louisiana bayous. Lafitte obtained a letter of marque from the revolutionary government of Colombia in 1810, and because American merchants continued to trade with the Spanish, Lafitte justified seizing them in the name of Colombia, though, of course, he kept the ships and their cargoes for himself. During the War of 1812, Lafitte provided support to Andrew Jackson in the defense of New Orleans, and in recognition of that, President Madison issued him a general pardon. Soon afterward, however, Lafitte returned to his former ways, operating from a new base at Campeche, now Galveston, in the new Republic of Mexico. By 1818, there were so many privateers turned pirates that the United States ordered Oliver Hazard Perry, the hero of the Battle of Lake Erie, to undertake a diplomatic mission to convince Venezuela to be more discriminating in issuing letters of marque. Perry succeeded in doing so, but he caught yellow fever during his cruise and died at the young age of only 34. Meanwhile, American merchant shipping continued to fall prey to privateers or pirates or both, so that finally, in 1822, the United States sent a naval squadron to the Caribbean. Now, in addition to maintaining a permanent squadron in the Mediterranean, the U.S. Navy also had a full-time squadron in the West Indies. The commander of the West Indian Squadron, which consisted of 4 frigates and 8 smaller ships, was Commodore James Biddle, who discovered almost at once that his big frigates, while certainly impressive looking, were all but helpless in hunting pirates. Pirate vessels during the 1820s looked nothing at all like the big three-masted sailing ships commanded by Errol Flynn or Johnny Depp in the movies. Most were tiny. Many had only a single mast and often only a single gun, but they were crammed full of men, and they seized their prizes by boarding. If a larger warship caught them, they might simply run their little vessel onto the beach of a nearby island and flee into the countryside. Biddle had overwhelming naval superiority in the Caribbean, but he found it frustrating trying to chase down and catch the tiny, handy pirate vessels. After a year, Biddle was succeeded in command of the West Indies Squadron by David Porter, a bold and audacious officer who had conducted a dramatic campaign against British shipping in the Pacific during the War of 1812. When Porter took over from Biddle, he retired most of the big ships and relied instead on 10 small Chesapeake-based schooners, vessels not unlike those used by the pirates themselves. Indeed, Congress was beginning to wonder if it had made a mistake in authorizing those big ships of the line and heavy frigates just 5 years before. In 1821, Congress cut the appropriation for those big ships in half and spent the money saved on more small ships to combat the pirates. An interesting characteristic of this Mosquito Squadron, as it was sometimes called, was the devolution of rather surprising authority onto quite junior officers. The length of time it took for messages from Washington to reach a squadron commander or the individual officers who commanded the ships meant that quite young junior officers were all but sovereign. When a crisis erupted, a naval officer seldom had time to check with Washington. He had to decide for himself how to react. In the spring of 1823, for example, 26-year-old Lieutenant Cornelius Stribling, commanding a small armed schooner, discovered several pirate vessels anchored in Cuban waters. Stribling attacked them at once. The pirates fled inland, and Stribling sent a landing party ashore to pursue them, essentially invading Spanish territory. The U.S. government's willingness to sanction and even applaud such action is evidenced by the fact that the main pedestrian walkway on the grounds of the U.S. Naval Academy is Stribling Walk. 3 months later, 22-year-old Lieutenant David Farragut, who would become an American naval hero 40 years later during the Civil War, led another American landing party ashore in Cuba, attacking and destroying a Spanish fort that was protecting pirate ships. When the Spanish protested, they were told that if they didn't want the U.S. warships to violate their sovereignty, they shouldn't provide protection for pirates. There were limits, however, to what either Spain or the United States would tolerate. In 1824, some pirates raided a warehouse in Danish St. Thomas in the Lesser Antilles and stole $5,000 worth of goods. U.S. Navy Lieutenant Charles Platt traced the pirates to Farardo in Puerto Rico. Wearing civilian clothes, he went ashore to investigate. He delivered a protest to the Spanish governor and was walking back to his ship when he and a midshipman accompanying him were arrested as spies. Platt suspected that the Spanish did it to buy time for the pirates to get away. After he was released, he reported all this to Commodore Porter. Porter was greatly angered, and he led a 3-ship squadron to Farardo, landed an armed party, threatened to destroy the town if the Spanish did not apologize. Now, to 21st century ears, this sounds like an overreaction. But in the 19th century, naval officers were especially touchy about matters of personal and national honor. On this occasion, the Spanish governor apologized and Porter withdrew. And that might have been the end of it. But Spanish leaders were touchy about their honor too, and ripples of anger from Porter's high-handed actions reached all the way to Madrid. Consequently, the United States Navy subjected Porter to a court-martial for exceeding his orders and found him guilty. Porter was infuriated. He resigned from the Navy in protest and accepted a commission as a Mexican admiral. U.S. Navy actions in the Caribbean continued without him. And by 1825, while piracy was not ended, it was severely curtailed. But there were pirates elsewhere, including in South Asia, and especially through the critical passage of the Strait of Malacca, the narrow stretch of water between the Malay Peninsula at the southernmost extremity of the Asian mainland and the island of Sumatra. This shipping channel between the Pacific and the Indian Oceans was, and still is, one of the busiest waterways on Earth. Pirates operating out of Sumatra attacked mostly British and Dutch vessels, but they occasionally attacked American shipping too. A particularly notorious example was an attack on the merchant vessel Friendship out of Salem, Massachusetts. In 1831, the Friendship was anchored off the village of Quallah, Battoo on the west coast of Sumatra. When her captain went ashore to negotiate for a cargo of pepper, 3 small pirate vessels came alongside. Their crews swarmed over the Friendship, killed her officers, ransacked the ship before heading back to shore. The Friendship's skipper managed to reclaim the ship with the assistance of friendly locals and sail her back to Salem, where there was an immediate public outcry against this outrage. Among the outraged was President Andrew Jackson, who was determined to exact revenge. He dispatched the Navy frigate USS Potomac under Captain John Downes to find the pirates and punish them. It was a long trip. Downes and the Potomac sailed across the Atlantic, rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa, crossed the Indian Ocean, and yet when he arrived at Quallah Battoo months later, the pirate vessels were still there. Downes attacked them at once. The Potomac used its broadside guns to suppress the forts protecting the harbor at Quallah Battoo, and then Downes sent a raiding party of 282 sailors and Marines into the harbor to burn the pirate ships. The locals fought back, and before it was over, 150 Malayans had died at the cost of 2 Americans killed and 11 wounded. Porter's behavior at Farardo had led to his court-martial, but Downes was lauded for his bold action at Quallah Battoo. In large part, this was because while it was necessary to be cautious in dealing with European governments, no such discretion was needed in dealing with local populations half a world away. Afterward, Downes warned the locals at Quallah Battoo that any future piratical attacks on American ships would result in the destruction of the nearest town, and he sailed away. That did not end piracy in the area. 6 years later, in 1838, Malay pirates attacked the American merchant ship Eclipse, killing everyone on board and looting the ship. The United States sent another squadron under Commodore George Reed, this time with 2 frigates, the Columbia and the John Adams, to punish the culprits. At Quallah Battoo, Reed, like Downes, immediately attacked. After an hour's bombardment, the forts and the town surrendered. The local chief pledged that no American ship would ever again be attacked in the strait. And just to make sure no one missed the point, Reed destroyed another nearby town that local pirates had used as a base. Besides pirates, the United States Navy in the 1830s also dealt with slave ships. Congress had outlawed the slave trade in 1808, and one element of the Treaty of Ghent that had ended the War of 1812 obligated both Britain and the United States to work toward ending the international traffic in slaves. For a while, the United States maintained a small naval force on the west coast of Africa, but Southern congressmen objected. Not necessarily because they wanted to reopen the slave trade, though some did, but because the very existence of such a force implied that there was something wrong with slavery. Indeed, Southern congressmen were sensitive to any perceived criticism of slavery in the wake of the growing abolitionist movement. As a result, the U.S. Navy stopped its slave trade patrols, and it was left to the Royal Navy to patrol the illegal slave trade. In an effort to elude the British patrols, slave traders often resorted to a ruse. When the captain of a slave ship saw that he was being pursued by a British warship, he often raised the American flag. Not fooled by this obvious subterfuge, the British usually stopped them anyway and succeeded in returning thousands of enslaved persons back to Africa. But rather than applaud this, the United States objected. American diplomats insisted that even if it was a ruse, even if the pirates were flying an American flag illegally, the U.S. did not want Royal Navy warships to stop any ship flying an American flag. The British were perplexed by this. The ships were not really American, they argued. It was the slavers who were abusing the American flag. Doesn't matter, the American diplomats replied. The American flag is sacred and not to be interfered with. Well, what was the solution here? In time, the United States Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, and the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Ashburton, worked out an arrangement. In the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842, the British agreed that they would no longer stop any ship flying the American flag, but in return, the Americans had to keep a naval squadron of their own off the African coast to deal with those slave traders who did so. The man who commanded this African squadron, Matthew Calbraith Perry, bore a familiar name. He was the younger brother of Oliver Hazard Perry, who had won the Battle of Lake Erie 28 years before. The younger Perry was a dedicated and efficient commander, but he was hamstrung by his rather curious orders. Due to the recalcitrance of Southern congressmen, the Navy Department instructed Perry that his primary job, even more important than interfering with the slave trade, was to make sure the British kept their word about not stopping American flag ships. As a result, Perry spent a lot of time following the British around off the coast of Africa to make sure they behaved themselves. It was a measure of the value that Americans attached to the sanctity of the American flag, even when it was being misused. Not surprisingly, these circumstances limited the effectiveness of his own squadron. During the ensuing decade, Royal Navy ships stopped, searched, and captured 596 illegal slave ships, 556 of which were condemned and compelled to return their human cargoes. During that same period, Perry's squadron captured only 19 slave ships, 6 of which were condemned. Not for another 20 years, in 1862, in the midst of the American Civil War, did the United States agree to allow Royal Navy ships to stop and search slave ships that illegally flew the American flag. These overseas issues meant that by the mid-19th century, the United States Navy had half a dozen naval squadrons stationed more or less permanently all over the world, in the Mediterranean to watch the Barbary States, in the Caribbean and the East Indies to look for pirates, and off Africa to look for slave traders and make sure the British behaved themselves. Other squadrons off Brazil and in the Pacific gave the U.S. Navy and the United States a global presence. It was a whole new ballgame.